Welcome back to Chinese 270, China and the West. Where had we left off last week? Well, we had just started to talk about what has to be my favorite topic, and that is tea. I'm just actually drinking a cup of Tea Guanyin, one of the finest Chinese teas, while I'm recording this lecture from a beautiful replica of a Qing Dynasty teacup. So let me take another sip. So I had said that tea continued to be by far the most important Chinese export article, particularly to England, to Great Britain, which is why taxing its consumption became so lucrative and important, not just to the Chinese, but maybe even more importantly to the British government. Crops of tea came into Canton over the months of the trading season. We discussed that. You might remember that image here on the right that sort of gives you the whole story of tea, from planting it up in the mountains and then transporting it down the river to where it was exported. Merchants negotiated the best price, tried to ship it home as quickly as possible because freshness meant the highest profit. Being the first back in London meant the highest profit, which then led to the development of these beautiful tea clippers. If you ever make it to London, to Greenwich, you should visit the Cutty Sark, which was one of the fastest and most profitable and most beautiful of those tea clippers. It's now a museum. Now, what is really interesting is that when it comes to tea, the China trade also connects America to our class in a really interesting way. And that is because essentially the birth of the United States is all connected to the China trade, and especially, of course, to the tea trade. Now, why is that? All of you, I'm sure who've studied American history, know that it was precisely anger over British tax on tea that the East India Company was exporting to the colonies, including America, that led to what? Well, the famous Boston Tea Party, right? No taxation without representation. The Americans were taxed for products, right? For tea. Those taxes went back to London. So let's remind ourselves how then the Boston Tea Party is all connected to the tea that would have been collected somewhere in the highlands of Fujian province. And I'm going to read a little passage from a wonderful book called The True History of Tea by a scholar called Victor Mayer. On a cold, clear night in December 1773, a band of freedom-loving Bostonians, barely disguised as Native Americans, made their way to the town's harbor, where the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver lay moored at the wharf, laden with tea. Having boarded the ships, these sons of liberty then broke open the chests stored in the holds and shoveled the tea into the sea. Soon the harbour was awash with 90,000 pounds of fragrant leaves. This is the most magnificent moment of all. The destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible, and it must have so important consequences and so lasting that I cannot but consider it as an epoch in history, wrote the Bostonian merchant John Adams, who was destined to become the second president of the new republic. The tea that filled Boston Harbor on that historic night had been picked at dawn in the hinterlands of the Fujian province of China, withered, tossed, oxidized, fired, rolled, packed in wooden chests lined with lead, carried by coolies shot in grass sandals, tasted and haggled over by plump merchants, journeyed 4 months in the damp storage of an East Indiaman round the Cape of Good Hope to London, broken, warehoused, and then reloaded by stevedores for the final, fateful voyage across the Atlantic. Well, and there you have it. And that is how tea from China essentially led to the birth of the United States. As we discussed, British merchants used to have a monopoly on the China trade, barring American merchants from conducting direct trade with Canton home merchants. Remember, this trade was incredibly profitable, but American merchants couldn't participate in it. Now, following the War of Independence and the establishing of the United States, the newly founded U.S. is cut off from Britain's China trade. And as a result, American merchants now start their own trade with Canton. Here you have a painting of the Empress of China. That was the first American merchant vessel to enter Chinese waters in 1784. And she returned to New York in 1785, selling a cargo of tea and porcelain at a 30% profit. Substantial return. So you see that the trade is not conducted across the Pacific yet from, say, San Francisco, right? No, in the 18th century, we're still on the East Coast, and it would have been a journey across the Atlantic and then across the Cape of Good Hope and then across the Indian Ocean all the way to China. Quite a journey. Now, President Washington allegedly bought a set of Chinese porcelain tableware from the ship, because when the Empress of China returned to New York, it really was a huge celebration, a huge media event, and purchasing probably from the ship meant a huge deal to a lot of people. Soon after, a group of American merchants from Salem, Massachusetts, start to engage in the China trade for real. And most of the imports, surprise, are tea and silk. But there is also really, it's a two-way traffic. They export furs, which are highly sought after in China, and increasingly ginseng. Now, sadly, American merchants are also involved in the opium trade because it is so profitable. Now, Salem merchants also bring back a lot of porcelain, paintings, furniture, and other curios, and eventually that leads to the founding of the East India Marine Society in 1799, which becomes one of America's first museums, which exists to this day as the Peabody Essex Museum of Salem. And if you ever have the chance to visit Salem, Massachusetts, you have to promise me to visit the Peabody Essex Museum. It's a fabulous museum, not only because they have a replica of an East India man called Friendship, right? Here's an image of that, but also because they hold the largest collection of trade paintings in the world, of which you all are by now real specialists. And of course, they have a ton of other things, beautiful bowls. They actually have a replica of a Ming Dynasty Chinese mansion. They bought more recently an old mansion in China and brought it to Salem, stone by stone, tile by tile, and rebuilt it. It's really a splendid museum. Now, in the meantime, Hong Kong, about which we talked a lot last week, turns into a bustling trading point with a population of roughly 120,000 by the 1870s. Now, most of them were Chinese. They weren't foreigners. There were, at that time, only a few hundred Europeans living there, but the number of Europeans also would grow. Of course, it would always just be a tiny fraction of Chinese who came there, for opportunities, also because the late 19th century in China saw a lot of civil wars, so it was a safer place to be. But also we see increasingly immigrants from other British colonies. A lot of merchants or people from India come to Hong Kong for opportunities. And of course, to this day, you actually still see that in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong, in a way, becomes a bit of a melting pot, and definitely a place that can no longer be ignored by the Chinese, even Chinese government officials living just across the border, so to speak, in close proximity. And one of them is Huang Zunxian, a very, very important Qing Dynasty government official, poet, born 1848, not far from Hong Kong. And like many of his generation, he really was a man caught between two worlds. What I mean by that is he witnessed then the birth essentially of Hong Kong. He travels to Hong Kong in the 1860s and he witnesses this Western modernity side by side, imperial China, traditional China. So he was traditionally trained to pass the civil service exams, which he eventually does in 1877. So you can see how long it would take people to achieve success in the exams. He then joins the newly established Zhongli Yamen, or really the Foreign Office of the General Management of Affairs concerning the various countries, which China had done following the Opium Wars. Huang Zunxian is then part of a Chinese mission to Meiji Japan. He later writes a history of Japan, which was not so much a history, more, if you want, a political treatise about modern Japan. As a side note, he was later assigned as consul general to San Francisco, where he witnessed, among other things, anti-Chinese labor movements in California and wrote about that. He was later sent to London to act as the counsel of the Chinese embassy there, then reassigned to Singapore. He edited China's first journal for contemporary affairs. And in 1894, during an audience with the Guangxu emperor, he was asked what aspect of Europe he felt might be superior to China, and he answered, "The strength of Europe is entirely due to reforms. When I was in London, I heard the British gentlemen say that 100 years ago their government was still inferior to China, and now see where they are." So Huang Zunxian then, I said, was a man caught between two worlds, but he was definitely somebody who saw the need for reform and who became a proponent for modernization. And I want to share a poem with you that he wrote on a visit to Hong Kong. And here's an English translation: "A foreign chief with curly hair, wealthy foreigners with blue eyes, round silver coins imprinted on them Queen Victoria. In their pagodas they honor Jesus. Fire trees glitter with silver petals, their felt fabric beautifully embroidered for sale in stores. After strongmen developed the land, this city of desire, also a city of immortals." Based on your reading, based on this poem, what is Huang Zunxian's view of Hong Kong and of Western and of Chinese civilization? How does he view the West? How does he view this new threat, this new reality on the borders of China? Maybe something we can discuss during our weekly discussion session, or something that you might even want to discuss in the forum. Now, what does become clearer and clearer then for more and more Chinese officials is that there is a need for change, a need for some kind of reform, and that eventually leads to a movement that is usually referred to as the self-strengthening movement, or 洋务运动, westernization movement, or 自强运动, self-strengthening movement, which sort of falls into the latter half of the 19th century, and which was really an attempt at reversing dynastic decline following the Opium Wars, following that forced contact with the West, by making use of practical aspects of Western technology. And especially along the coast, we see the establishment of arsenals, or sort of combinations of factories with schools, places where, essentially research is conducted, where learning is collected. And the Jiangnan Arsenal is one of the most important of these. It leads to the building then of a Western or modern fleet, the Baiyang Fleet, the largest modern fleet in Asia at the time. And some of the ships were actually built in China. Here on the right you have a Chinese Western style warship built at another arsenal, the Fuzhou Arsenal. But many of those ships, many of those cannons were actually purchased from abroad, from the West. Now, one thing we also need to mention, because this will come up again in the second course stream, there are other threats to the Qing dynasty, not just threats from the outside, but there are also internal threats. And the most serious of these was a rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, which lasted almost 15 years and by some historians' estimate might have killed as many as 20 million people in the south of the country, that led some people to go to places like Hong Kong or even leave the country entirely and migrate to new places, including America. Now here you have two more images of that arsenal, the Jiangnan arsenal. You have a woodblock print on the left and then you have a photograph on the right, and it's kind of nice how really they correspond to each other. Well, why wouldn't they? Now one thing to remember about this period is that there is still a very strong belief in China that China as its essence, China in its philosophical, religious, cultural foundation was as strong as ever. And if only, one could adopt some of those functional or practical aspects of Western learning by way of translating Western texts, by way of inviting Western specialists and advisors, China could catch up. China could reform from within and face this new challenge. Now, it also led to a dialectic between hatred and admiration of the West, meaning obviously the West is increasingly perceived as a real threat, which, as we've seen in the Opium Wars, sometimes really resorts to despicable and rather hateful policies. But of course, more and more intellectuals also realize that the West really has an edge on China, especially when it comes to military technology or technology in general. So there is a fear then that reforms might just threaten the dynasty at its core, and that those institutions it was really meant to save, right, those reform movements might eventually be swept away by them. So this is something else we might want to remember going forward. And I think we will discuss this dialectic in our second course stream. So I will see you shortly.